course, resent this fact of the pandemic, preventing us all from traveling. I have to say, we have also appreciated how we can be connected, well, via the famous now Zoom or anyhow, some kind of webinar software. And sometimes it doesn't cease to amaze me. And I think as I hope we go out of the pandemic soon, we should keep some of the things that we have learned in this period. And saying this, I hope to see you all in Luxembourg in person and not via Zoom. Fingers crossed. Well, congratulations for having such a big and active standing group. That's fantastic, I think. And I think this is one of the things that the CPR offers, truly. And actually, I have to say, probably CPR was my first real conference when I was a PhD student. I don't want to say when, because many of you were probably in preschool then or were not born. So, but anyhow, I think it was in Essex in, 92, 93. So anyhow, and have been kind of on and off on ECPR ever since, although ECPR has a bit more of a political science perspective, and my research is a bit more sociological, but of course the commonalities are many. Today consulting with the 4 colleagues that coordinate the group, we felt that this paper that I'm actually currently writing and revising on temporary migration as a category of analysis or category of practice could be of general interest, and I would be very much looking forward to your comments and questions, also in helping me, clarify my thoughts fully. I'll start sharing my screen. Yes, here we are. Yes, here it is. So this is, well, I think it is not very difficult to understand where this question comes from, because temporary migration has been, increasingly an aspect of migration. And actually what I'm really asking, I think in this paper, does it make sense to speak of temporary migration? And if it does, in what ways can we become a bit more specific and a bit more ontologically and epistemologically accurate in speaking about temporary migration? Because in a way, every migration is temporary, or at least that is what the migrant thinks. That is the myth of migration. You're going and probably will return. And certainly that is the case for migrations, within Europe or more broadly, even though, living now in Canada, and maybe from a Canadian perspective, we in the past had more this idea, so that people who were going to Australia or to North America were taking this as more of a lifetime decision. But what we're witnessing today, including in places like Canada, that is if you want, by excellence, a destination country, and I'll say a couple of words about this in a minute, so is that temporary migration becomes increasingly common, both in terms of the various schemes that regulate temporary migration, for instance, towards Canada, but also in terms of people's journeys and people's intentions. And that is the second starting point for this reflection and this paper, is that our migration trajectories, both of highly skilled but also of lower skilled people, are increasingly fragmented and non-linear. So migration is no longer understood as from origin to destination, but the destinations can be multiple, and they can be in a chain order. So like I go from country A to B and from B to C, but they can also be like I go from A to B, go back, and then for different reasons I leave again and go to another country. And certainly there's something to be said there about the mixed motivations. So temporary migration, or that is again a general observation, that the motivations of migration, while predominantly economic, they can also have important, for instance, political components of protection and humanitarian flows, and not just the motivation of a better job and a better income. And it is increasingly difficult to distinguish, I think, between the two. And I think we're all witnessing this also in our own research, in that we speak more and more actually, those of us who work on migration increasingly work also on asylum, and asylum is no longer something for international lawyers and human rights experts. Speaking about the preference for temporary and circular migration, I think, of course, when I speak there about the preference, I mean more the preference of destination countries, or perhaps to a certain extent also countries of origin, to the extent that they can see in temporary and circular migration an element of brain circulation and not brain drain, but rather the possibility of remittances, both economic and social, coming back to the country of origin, and of avoiding, educating people or training people and then having them leave. Having said that, I just want to make a footnote about Canada, because I think it is a case that can prompt, or has prompted me, and I think can prompt many of you to rethink your views. And I don't know, I mean, I thought I was familiar with Canadian immigration policy when I came here, but only I discovered that my familiarity was very limited. And I had not very much realized that Canada brings a lot of people directly as permanent residents. So it's not just that the country has a proactive immigration policy, that it invites people, that it has a point system, and a lot of other things, but it's also the idea and the practice that people normally here come as permanent residents. And I want to make a footnote in this and say that I'm not yet a permanent resident. So I went to Canada with a work permit, and I'm now with my family applying for a permanent residency. And actually it was interesting, like a colleague told me, speaking about practical issues, and tax declarations and all this. And he said, Canada doesn't care about you as long as you're, a temporary work permit holder. They only care about you in both good and bad ways once you're a permanent resident. So you only exist in the landscape. And at the time, I thought that was last year. At the time, I thought that was a very exaggerated statement. But then I realized that it is true that generally in Canada, the norm is you come as a permanent resident. However, having said this, looking at data, and the other day at the webinar we had in my program here, looking at the data, so Canada brings in every year 350,000 people, and these targets of annual net immigration have risen to 410,000 for this year, and slightly rising in the 3-year plan. And Canada has 36 or 37 million people, so it's about 1% of the population each year. So you can see, and it is a proactive immigration policy. At the same time, Canada in 2019 brought, under different schemes, so it brought about, well, it had 400,000 international students, and here international students are classified as temporary migrants technically, and about another 500,000 people under different schemes that range from seasonal farm workers to live-in and live-out caregivers, to people like me, to people in the trades category. So all sorts of things. And I think this says something about the tension that can exist between our economic prerogatives in terms of labor markets and just-in-time migrant labor, and our political prerogatives that in a country, for instance, like Canada, more than in European countries, there is a wish for long-term migration. So I think that in a way makes all the more, I think, necessary to discuss what is exactly temporary migration and how does the reality of migration on the ground coincide or deviate from actually what is envisaged in policy. And I think there too, we need to understand migration in its very specific socioeconomic context of the 21st century. So in a context of no longer, or if you want to say a post-industrial economies, and where migrant labor is very much absorbed in sectors that are very, how can I say, volatile, where they are characterized by small employers. It's no longer the post-World War II migrations of people going to work in big factories and in big companies and in mines and in the industry. But now we see a lot of polarization actually in the labor markets, where temporary migrants are found at the highest and the lowest ends of the scale. So on one hand, we find temporary migrants as professionals, researchers, highly skilled managers, engineers, medical doctors, paramedical personnel, in the kind of migrants that in Europe and elsewhere are presented as the migrants we want, the famous desired migration of Sarkozy of 10 years ago. And however, temporary migrants are also predominantly found in the lower end of the labor market, more into, making sense of it more through dual labor market theory. So in those areas that the locals do not want, those dirty, dangerous, and demanding jobs, like in agriculture. And what we have, we researchers, and I'm sure many of you in your work have discussed, is this permanent temporariness. So, and the permanent temporariness for highly skilled migrants is defined as, the expat community, or may I say as people like us that can, move from one country to another following an academic career path, or people in the business sector following, again, their own careers. But this permanent temporariness, in that case, is a bit, in our case, is kind of more voluntary and flexible, while we find a lot of permanent temporariness in the lower end of the scale, among, for instance, seasonal farm workers that have hit the headlines during the last months under the pandemic, where people do not choose but are obliged to this permanent temporariness, because this is the way these sectors are regulated, and because they do not have the socioeconomic and the migration conditions to bring their families and kind of settle at destination, while they would probably want to. And we have seen also, particularly in agriculture, the discussion in Europe being one of, I think, more than thinking about the rights or the long-term perspectives in migration that should be given to, for instance, temporary workers in agriculture. The discussion has been more, we need to renovate agriculture and do more automation. And at the same time, of course, we've witnessed the tensions of this discussion of these migrants being actually essential components of our economies and our societies. Now, going to my analytical reflection. So what I'm trying to do in this paper that I'm writing is thinking of temporariness in terms of a category of analysis for us researchers, and asking when is it how is it defined by governments in terms of forced temporariness, for instance, for refugees, regulated temporariness, that is the one that we know best and have discussed most, and flexible temporariness, which is basically what is happening in the EU, but also in other world regions like MERCOSUR in Latin America, where people can circulate freely among the countries that are members of MERCOSUR. So I thought that was an element. While we've discussed this permanent temporariness de facto, we haven't looked enough at how this is defined in terms of the policies, if we want to analyze the policies. And I'm talking about forced temporariness, not in the sense of seasonal workers having to go back to their countries when their permits expire, or not being allowed to stay more than 6 or 9 months at destination, but more in terms of refugees, because refugees are, in theory, by excellence, a temporary group, because they ask for protection for that time while they cannot be in their country, and they cannot be in their country either because they're persecuted or because there's conflict and instability and conditions that do not provide for security. So in theory, refugees are temporary, and we all know, for instance, that oftentimes refugees end up in Spain, but we see this temporariness also, particularly in Europe, in the category of subsidiary or protection for people like, for instance, Syrians, who are not fleeing individual persecution, but they are fleeing conflict and instability in their country. And we see now that places like Turkey in particular are trying to force Syrians to go back because Syria is now more stable and in theory more peaceful. So that is one type, I think, of forced temporariness that we need to think about in terms of our analysis. Now, second, as I said, is the best known type of temporariness, which is seasonal migration in agriculture, in tourism, in catering, in construction, and we've seen in many, in many, how can I say, different facets in Europe, and we have seen it particularly. I mean, for instance, my own work has also highlighted how such temporariness can be regulated, but it can also be spontaneous and partly informal. Because people may use, for instance, a permit that exists for agriculture, but then engage in employment in construction, or for instance, move from one region to another. And while initially they were working agriculture, then work for tourism in a seasonal way. And we know that there is a directive, an EU directive that regulates these issues in the EU, but that the interpretations of the directive can be quite flexible and subject to the particular regional economic realities, not even national, but regional economic realities in those areas where agriculture or tourism is strong. And last, the flexible temporariness is intra-EU migration, as you understand it, because people can move back and forth. And we've seen this very much in the study, for instance, of intra-EU migration after the economic crisis of 2009 and during the acute phases of the Eurozone economic crisis, where we've seen, for instance, people from Southern Europe and Ireland moving to other European countries. But we've also seen, for instance, Romanian migrants that were in Italy, that were in Spain, moving, for instance, to Italy that was less affected by the crisis, or trying to move, say, to France or Germany to seek work, because obviously they had the right to do so. And I think this is perhaps, from a policy perspective, not even conceived as temporary migration, because this is what we would call an enhanced regional mobility regime. But not in all cases is it supported by a citizenship set of rights, like in the EU, like in MERCOSUR. It doesn't come with a citizenship, but however, what is emphasized is because the MERCOSUR countries share important historical, cultural, and political ties, they should facilitate temporary movement within the region. And we've seen that this system has worked with its problems, has worked during the Venezuelan crisis that has been going on now for over 5 years. Getting to my next, the next part of my reflection is, however, how does this relate to the temporary migration on the ground, and how do migrants perceive their migration? Because we know oftentimes that migrants take up a temporary migration scheme and opportunity, but not because they plan to be temporary, but simply because this is the only option available for them. So I think we would benefit from an understanding of the extent to which a temporary stay was intentional or planned, or it was befallen on them, or if you want, imposed on them. So an intentional or planned temporariness can be, again, in the higher end, that of intra-company transferees, but it can also be that of domestic and care workers that may do this either sometimes also voluntarily. One area where we have seen that, and in my work, for instance, with Sabrina Marchetti on circularity of Ukrainian domestic workers between, for instance, Italy and the Ukraine, where this circularity was intentional because the workers involved had important care obligations also in the country of origin, and also found that this was a more livable solution for them, because staying kind of long-term in Italy often in a live-in care job was too heavy emotionally. So we can see that there can different reasons why people may intend or plan their stay to be temporary. And at the same time, we know, so I think this is important. We shouldn't think that migrants always want to be long-term, because there are important reasons why they need to be staying for a period of time and perhaps circulate between two countries. Then, of course, there is the other area of what I call befallen temporariness, so the temporariness that is imposed on you because of your visa or because of your the type of employment that you're getting and your migration status. And again, a third category there that reflects the flexible temporary schemes that I discussed just earlier is what I call, from an intentional perspective of the migrant, open-ended. And you may ask, why is this not intentional or planned and you call it open-ended? Is because I think, particularly intra-EU migrants, knowing that they have the possibility to circulate, may have a different take on their migration plan. So they may be really kind of, and again, we've seen this in some studies documenting what is called onwards or return intra-EU migration, where, for instance, Romanians settled in Spain might have tried either to move to another country or to go back to Romania, but leaving temporarily the family in Spain, seeing what is the situation in Romania and whether they can go back, or eventually deciding to move the whole family to Italy. So this is the kind of open-ended temporariness, and I would say probably is the more, how can I say, quintessential of our time, where transport and communication has us so interconnected that people can really make their plans in a very active way and have more agency and more control over their migration project. At the same time, of course, we know that this is probably available only to people with specific migration status. Intra-EU migrants are one status that has this kind of flexibility for open-ended temporariness. I have tentatively put in there international students, because international students are, again, one of those categories of temporary migrants that are desired by destination countries, because they bring young, highly skilled people who bring their money to the destination country. And if they were to stay, many countries have various schemes that help this transition from the temporary status of the student to the long-term status of the student. And I think many times international students have not decided during their studies whether they want to stay or go back, or probably they think they want to go back, but they eventually stay. So that brings me to my final 2 points in this paper is about to discussing the role of migrant agency and the role of intermediaries in this kind of analytical framework of migration, temporary migration as a category of analysis and as a category of practice. So if we want to look at the analytical, at the analytical level, we want to look at what is the role of migrant agency in temporary migration. I think the role is very important, and it's kind of ongoing to the extent that we see temporariness as a category of practice. So we need to pay attention to the kind of resources that migrants, different types of migrants, can mobilize, and this can be human capital, obviously credentials and skills, and with skills, I want to emphasize that these are not just degrees from colleges and universities, but can also be concrete work skills, as we have seen with the case of farm workers. Of course, social capital is very important in temporary migration and in navigating whether the policy hurdles or the opportunities of the labor market. And these include friends, relatives, diaspora organizations, but also employment or travel agencies and employers themselves. And of course, the material capital. So when people travel as international students under a study visa or as economically independent persons, these are very important resources in navigating a temporary migration context. Now, on the other hand, it is important also to note that temporary migration gives rise to a whole industry that takes more that has a higher importance in the context of temporary migration rather than in the context of a one-time migration. I leave Italy and I come settle in Canada and that's it. So I need these intermediaries only once. But if I'm a temporary migrant, for instance, employment and travel agencies are very important. And we have seen very interesting studies in this sector in the care industry in Europe, but we have seen this also in, studies in other world regions, like for instance, South Asian migrations to the United Arab Emirates and the role of employment agencies in managing these temporary and circular migrations for construction or care work in the Middle East, in the Emirates in particular. And travel agencies there play a role because oftentimes they're really, important brokers of this situation, and they can help people prepare their arrival or their return. Non-governmental organizations, I think in this context can be very important because temporary migrants compared to more kind of long-term migrants may not know their rights, may not know the language, may not have developed networks at the destination. And of course, lawyers, I think, are part of this because whether they are pro bono lawyers linked to non-governmental organizations to help migrants or, professional lawyers. And I can tell you there, again, here in Canada, like in the US and in Australia, immigration law is a big professional sector. It's a really big professional sector. It's a whole industry of lawyers and legal assistants that work, with migrants to help them navigate through the different statuses, particularly if one is a temporary migrant or an international student and want to make their stay long-term. Educational institutions, I think, have been also, under the shadow in discussing temporary migration that far. And while I am myself, and this is something perhaps for our discussion, I'm myself a bit hesitant to put international students under the guise of temporary migration like they are classified here in Canada. I think there is a point to be, there is an important point of reflection there, because educational institutions have become in many countries, and we'll see it now in the UK, not just with what was before international students, but now also with EU students, they become important brokers of such temporary migration, and they become important parts of this industry along, for instance, as I said, lawyers, migrant associations, and of course, international organizations that also play a role in supporting and regulating these different types of temporary migration. So eventually, yeah, and to conclude, my last, in a way, question for you, and that I would be happy to hear your views and answer your questions is, can we really speak of a single typology of temporary migrants, or is this variation making the category of temporary migration too broad to matter, too broad to be useful? Do you find this framework that I proposed of the category of analysis and category of practice as useful to create a taxonomy? And as you saw, I have tried to look more on one hand on policy and regulation in terms of analysis, and practice in terms of the agency of migrants and their intentions, and try to see how the two interact. But I have not touched upon the question of time, because we know there's different definition. The classical definition of temporary migration is anything under 12 months. But then how do we measure time when these are repeated periods of, say, 6 or 8 months within a calendar year? And of course, the macro, meso, and micro dimensions that I try to figure out in terms of the different actors and how they make part of this reflection. So I would like to conclude here and invite your comments and questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.